as we think about some of the things that are going on in the world, some of the persecution that is happening. I'm reminded in the book Four Agreements, the author says that mistaken assumptions that sometimes we just take for granted are the source of much conflict that we experience in our lives. Could it be that some of the things that we see, some of the things that we do in our own personal lives, some of the conflicts that we see are because of mistaken assumptions? This morning I want to begin with a bit of poetry. I hope there's a few poets among us. And for me, if it's going to be a good poem, it's got to rhyme. So I've got a poem here that I want to share with you. It's a story that I've heard before. You may have heard before, but I've never read it in a poem form. The poem is called The Cookie Thief by Valerie Cox. And this is how it goes. A woman was waiting at an airport one night with several long hours before her flight. She hunted for a book in the airport shops, bought a bag of cookies, and found a place to drop. She was engrossed in her book, but happened to see that the man sitting beside her, as bold as could be, grabbed a cookie or two from the bag in between, which she tried to ignore and to avoid a scene. So she munched the cookies and watched the clock as the gusty cookie thief diminished her stock. She was getting more irritated as the minutes ticked by, thinking, if I wasn't so nice, I would blacken his eye. With each cookie she took, he took one too. When there was only one left, she wondered what he would do. With a smile on his face and a nervous laugh, he took the last cookie and broke it in half. He offered her half as he ate the other, and she snatched it from him and thought, oh, brother, this guy has some nerve, and he is so rude. Why, he didn't even show any gratitude. She had never known when she had been so galled, and she sighed with relief when her flight was called. So she gathered her belongings and headed to the gate, refusing to look back at the thieving ingrate. She boarded the plane and sank in her seat. Then she sought her book, which was almost complete. And as she reached into her bag, she gasped in surprise, because there was a bag of cookies in front of her eyes. If mine are here, she moaned in despair, the others were his, and he tried to share. Too late to apologize, she realized with grief that she was the rude one, the ingrate, the thief. How many times have we absolutely known that something was one way only to be shown that our assumptions were false, we got it all wrong, and judged that poor person when it was us all along? You ever been there? Ever had something like that happen to you? Ever made assumptions, jumped to conclusions without knowing all the facts, and then all of a sudden you realize that you have got it wrong? The lady in the poem simply assumed the cookies were hers, only to discover in the end that she was stealing somebody else's cookies. And let's face it, at times we all make assumptions. But the problem is when we make assumptions about people and then we put them into a box, or we begin to judge them and act differently towards them. Alan Alda, he says, begin challenging your own assumptions. Your assumptions are a window on the world. Scrub them off every once in a while, or the light won't come in. We all at times make assumptions. And recently, when I find that I have made an assumption only to discover that what I thought wasn't so much the case, my mind has gone back to a story that we find in the Old Testament. And if you got your Bibles, I invite you to turn with me to this story. It's found in the book of Joshua, Joshua chapter 22. This year, for my personal devotion time with God, I've been reading through the Bible. And as I reread this story again earlier this year, it really jumped out at me. And I just want to share this with you today. Joshua 22, but I actually want to set the scene by looking at the last few verses in Joshua 21. Joshua 21 verses 43 and on, and this sets the scene for what is to follow. In Joshua 21 verse 43 it says, "So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give to their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands." Verse 45, "Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled." I love that. And even before we get into the message today, maybe that is why you are here. Maybe that is what you need to hear today. Not one of God's promises failed. Every single promise that he made has come true. You can bank on God's promises. His promises never fail. And because they never fail, the Israelites find themselves in a position when, on the whole, the land has been conquered. And they're about to go in, and the land is about to be distributed. The wars are all over. The promised land is now there. And people are going back to their place that they have inherited. With this background, let's now look at this chapter, Joshua chapter 22. Let's go from verse 1 to 3. "Then Joshua summoned the Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh. And he said to them, 'You have done all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. And you have obeyed me in everything I commanded. For a long time now, to this very day, you have not deserted your fellow Israelites, but have carried out the mission that the Lord your God gave you.'" What was this mission? What was the mission that the Lord gave these 2.5 tribes? Well, you may remember the story. It's actually found in Numbers 32. When Israel was marching through the wilderness of Gilead, these 2.5 tribes, they came to Moses and they said, hey Moses, wait a minute, just hang on. We know that God has promised us the promised land over the river. We know that he has promised us Canaan, but we actually like the land here. We think the land on this side of the river would be quite good. We think it'll be good for our families, good for our cattle. We know there is an inheritance over the other side, but could we inherit this part of the land? And Moses looked at them and he said, under one condition, that the soldiers of the 2.5 tribes continued to fight against the enemies of Israel with the rest of the tribes. And that was the deal. And that's what they did. And some scholars believe it was about 7 years that they continued to fight side by side with their fellow Israelites as they cleared out the land so that the whole of Israel could inherit it. And this is what Joshua means in verse 2 when he says, "You have done all that Moses has commanded." Literally, you have fought the good fight. You have not forsaken your brothers. You have kept the commandments of the Lord your God. Now let's look at verse 4 and verse 5. He continues, "Now that the Lord your God has given them rest as he promised, return to your homes in the land that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan." Verse 5, "But be very careful to keep the commandments and the law that Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to keep his commandments, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul." Have a look at some of the words that are mentioned there, the charge that Joshua gives these seasoned soldiers. He tells them to rigorously love their love and obedience for God. And if you want to be a man or woman after God's own heart, here are some good things that you can look at. Joshua says to them, look at you got to keep the commandments. Love the Lord your God. Walk in all his ways. Obey his commandments. Hold fast to him and serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. And this is what they were commanded to do. God's men go hard after God. They are characterized by a passion for God. And this is what Joshua wanted for these men. This is what he wanted them to do. And so he blesses them. He sends them on their way. And they begin to make their way back to the land that they have inherited over the other side of the river. And I imagine that as they're going back, they pass places where they remember where God has touched them in various ways. They remember where God has done some amazing things. And they remember fighting with their fellow Israelites side by side and seeing the amazing things that God has done. And then when they get to where they were going, they do something out of the ordinary. Have a look at verse 10 and 11. Joshua 22, verse 10. When they came near Geruthith, near the Jordan in the land of Canaan, the Reubenites, the Gadites, the half-tribe of Manasseh, they built an imposing altar there by the Jordan. And when the Israelites heard that they had built the altar on the border of Canaan at Geruth, near the Jordan at the Israelite side, the whole assembly of Israel gathered at Shiloh to go to war against them. Sorry? Did we read that right? Could that be right? As we're reading through this chapter, we see everything is going so incredibly well. I mean, the wars are over, the land is there. They have been reminded that God's promises never ever fail. They have done everything the Lord has commanded to do, and they were charged and then blessed to follow God. And the next thing you know, the very men that they were fighting with side by side for the last 7 years turn around and they're ganging up and they're marching against them. They declare war against them. The turn of events here is in this text is just jarring. Why? What is going on? How can something that was going so well turn around so quickly? Unfortunately, we probably know the answer because we might had this happen to us, or we might have done it ourselves. When things were going well, then all of a sudden there was a crisis. I'm reminded of the family of 5 who was enjoying a lovely meal of mushrooms together with their family, and they were feeding some to the cat when all of a sudden they noticed that the cat was having some stomach contractions. While the members of the family showed no signs of illness, they thought, look at this cat. They raced to the hospital where they had their stomachs pumped out. Feeling safe after that, they returned home only to find that they didn't have one cat anymore, but another 5 because the cat had given birth to kittens. 1 minute, things may be going along really well. And then a simple assumption can cause pain and tension. Perhaps we're getting along well with our neighbour and our dog gets into the garbage, or our children fight with theirs, or what we say is taken in the wrong way, and then all of a sudden the war is on. In this case, we see there was conflict. And we see it was conflict over what was called a large, imposing altar. The 2.5 tribes had built this. And immediately as the Israelites saw this, they turned around and they marched against them for war. And in our story here, we see that it was escalating rapidly. And as we go and as we have a look, we can see that there are some tools that we can find to help resolve some of the conflicts that arise in our hearts and arise in our lives. The first thing they see is they went to the people they had a problem with. They didn't go anywhere else. They went to the people. And so before they attacked them, they talked to them. And as you see in verse 13 and 14, a delegation, a high-powered delegation, went and saw these people. It was sent on behalf of the 9.5 tribes, and they began negotiations towards reconciliation. And let's pick up what's happening in verse 15 and 16. Joshua 22, verse 16. When they, this is the delegation, went to Gilead, to Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribes of Manasseh, they said to them, the whole assembly of the Lord says, how could you break faith with the God of Israel like this? How could you turn away from the Lord and build yourselves an altar in rebellion against him? You see what the issue was here? They saw that there was a rebellion happening. In fact, some translations call it an altar of rebellion. How could you do that? How could you build an altar that goes against God? And look how passionate and wound up and angry they get about this. Verse 17, was not the sin of Peor enough for us? Up to this very day, we have not cleansed ourselves from that sin, even though a plague fell of the community of the Lord. And are you now turning away from the Lord? If you rebel against the Lord today, tomorrow he'll be angry with the whole community of Israel. If the land you possess is defiled, come over to the Lord's land where the Lord's tabernacle stands and share the land with us. But do not rebel against the Lord or against us by building an altar for yourselves, other than the altar of the Lord our God. When Achan was unfaithful in regard to the devoted things, did not wrath come on him and the whole community of Israel? He was not the only one who died for his sins. Can you see they're getting worked up about this? They're getting hot under the collar. 6 times in this passage, they invoke the name of the Lord. They were angry because the 2.5 tribes had built this altar, because they had gone against God, and because they were worried that the punishment would happen not only on them, but on all of Israel. And on the surface, they had a very good reason for being angry. Because you see, in Deuteronomy chapter 12, Moses casts a vision of what it will be like when they enter into the promised land. And now here they are. But here are Moses' words to the people all that time ago. He said, but you will cross the Jordan and settle into the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. And he will give you rest from all your enemies around you so that you will live in safety. Then the place of the Lord your God will choose as a dwelling place for his name, i.e. the tabernacle, which became the temple. There you are to bring everything I command you. And then he says this, be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings anywhere you please. Offer them only at the place the Lord will choose in one of your tribes, and there observe everything I command you. Do you see what's happening here? Do not sacrifice burnt offerings anywhere, God says, except for the place that I designate. Why did God say this? Maybe it was because he knew our tendency to idolatry. And he was saying, hey, I don't want this to happen. So come together for worship. Come together in the place where I say, this is the place where you come. And this is the place where you are to make your burnt offerings towards us. And so we can see that this imposing altar standing in front of them, these 9.5 tribes, they become very angry and they declare war on their brothers. But thankfully, before the first shot is fired, they agree to go and first talk to them. We need to do the same. Before we attack, we are to talk. Most of you know Matthew 18. If you have a problem with somebody, go and talk it out. If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault just between the two of you. Go and sort things out. Get together and sort it out. And this is what we see these guys doing. And it's just as well that they did. I don't know about you, but maybe there's something that you need to go and sort out with somebody. It may be a real issue, or it could be a simple matter of misunderstanding, of miscommunication, of one side making faulty assumptions and jumping to conclusions. You see, things are not always as they seem. As I was preparing this week, I came across this little cartoon that I want to show you. Here we see a guy making an assumption that just around the corner there is something that is beautiful to behold, when in reality it wasn't so much the case. And in the story that we are looking at, we see the opposite is true. The 9.5 tribes assume that there is something ugly that is happening. Yet when you look at the reason that they put it up, it was something beautiful indeed. Let's have a look at verse 21. Joshua 22 and verse 21. Then Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh replied to the heads of the clans of Israel, "The mighty one, God, the Lord, the mighty one, God, the Lord, he knows. And let Israel know. If this has been in rebellion or in disobedience to the Lord, do not spare us this day. If we have built our own altar to turn away from the Lord and to offer burnt offerings and grain offerings or to sacrifice fellowship offerings on it, may the Lord himself call us to account. No, we did it for fear that someday your descendants might say to ours, 'What do you have to do with the Lord, the God of Israel? The Lord has made the Jordan a boundary between us and you, you Reubenites and Gadites. You have no share in the Lord, so your descendants might cause ours to stop fearing the Lord.'" Verse 26, this is why we said, "Let us get ready and build an altar, but not for burnt offerings or sacrifices. On the contrary, it is to be a witness between us and you and the generations that follow, that we will worship the Lord at his sanctuary with our burnt offerings, sacrifices, and fellowship offerings. Then in the future your descendants will not be able to say to ours, 'You have no share in the Lord.' And we said, if they ever say this to us, to our descendants, we will answer, 'Look at the replica of the Lord's altar which our ancestors built, not for burnt offerings and sacrifices, but as a witness between us and you. Far be it from us to rebel against the Lord and turn away from him today by building an altar for burnt offerings, grain offerings, and sacrifices, other than the altar of the Lord our God that stands before his tabernacle.'" Hey, this altar that we built, it's not for burnt offerings. We're not going against what God has wanted us to do. In fact, we have set this up for the very reason there is a river that is dividing us. We don't want this bit of geography to divide our relationship. So we have installed this here so that we can know, so that we can remember that we are on the Lord's side. This is a witness to both of us. This is a witness of what we are saying. Now you think about in terms of perceptions. The tribes on the west of the Jordan, they put 2 and 2 together and they came up with 5. What they perceived wasn't complete reality. And doesn't this happen all the time to us? Someone fails to say hello to you. They fail to call you. They don't send you a Christmas card. And you conclude either that they're very unfriendly or they don't like you anymore. What are you doing? You find that you are judging. And it can be hurtful when people make false assumptions against you. But if that has happened to you, we can learn the way that it was responded in this story. They didn't get defensive. They didn't lash back. They didn't wilt on inferiority. They didn't have a pity party. They just said, no, this is the reason that we did this. This was our motivation. Sometimes we may question decisions that are made, but if we know the people, we should know what their motives are. Ellen White says this. She says, how often serious difficulties arise from a simple misunderstanding, even among those who are actuated by the worthiest motives. And without the exercise of courtesy or forbearance, what serious and even fatal results may follow. The 10 tribes remembered how, in Achan's case, God had rebuked the lack of vigilance to discover the sins existing among them. Now they resolved to act promptly and earnestly, but in seeking to shun their first error, they had gone to the opposite extreme. Instead of making courteous inquiry to learn the facts in the case, they had met their brethren with censure and condemnation. Had the men of Gad and Reuben retorted in the same spirit, war would have been the result. While it is important on one hand that the laxness in dealing with sin to be avoided, it is equally important on the other to shun harsh judgments and groundless suspicions. Well, as indicated here, this very fragile political situation in Joshua 22 ends happily. Have a look from verse 30 on. When Phinehas, the priest, and the leaders of the community, the heads of the clan of the Israelites, heard what Reuben, Gad, Manasseh had to say, they were pleased. And Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, said to Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, today we know that the Lord is with us, because you have not been unfaithful to the Lord in this matter. Now you have rescued the Israelites from the Lord's hand. Then Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the priest, and the leaders returned to Canaan from their meeting with the Reubenites and Gadites and Gideons, and they reported to the Israelites. They were glad to hear the report and praised God. And they talked no more about going to war against them to devastate the country where the Reubenites and the Gadites lived. So what lessons can we learn from this? Why did this potentially explosive situation turn out so well? Yes, the 9.5 tribes were direct, and yes, the 2.5 tribes weren't defensive. They just explained their position. But I think there might be a couple more critical issues here. And I think this chapter is not only a warning against apostasy, but it comes as a model of unity. And let me suggest that the remarkable unity here in Joshua 22 is a result of 2 fundamental commitments. And the first commitment they made was a commitment to the truth. And by that, I keep being drawn back to that verse in verse 5, where they said, yes, we are going to take this seriously. We are going to keep God's commandments. We are going to love God. We're going to walk with God. We're going to obey God. We're going to hold fast to Scripture. We are going to serve God. What about you? Are you a person intent on keeping, loving, serving, walking, obeying God with all your heart? Do you see living life in truth like that? Because a mutual commitment to this goes a long way in promoting harmony and unity and minimizing the conflicts that arise in the body of Christ. But there is something that is even more, possibly even more important, and this was it: a mutual commitment to love on the part of these tribes. People who elevate truth above love don't understand love. 1 Timothy 1 verse 5, Paul says, the goal of our instruction is love. The goal of our truth and the goal of our command is love. John 13 verse 35, by this all men may know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. If you love one another. And we see instances of this in this story here. In the middle of verse 19, we hear them say, if the land that you possess is defiled, hey, just come, just live with us. This is what they were saying. It was a generous offer, an expression of love. The land had already been divided, but hey, if you don't like this land, just come with us. It's not a problem. And again, we see it from the other side. When the 2.5 tribes in verse 22 and 23, they said, hey, if we're in sin, then God destroy us because we don't want to defile his name. We don't want to hurt you. That's love. These tribes had their differences. Their situation was complicated. It was complex. It was difficult. Assumptions were made. Conclusions were jumped to. It was turning into a great big mess. But they had these 2 commitments. Despite their differences, despite of their misunderstandings, there was this mutual commitment to love. To love one another. To be together. To forgive one another over and over again. 70 times 7. This is the message of Joshua 22. And this is what should and must characterize our relationships together. A mutual commitment for truth and for love. To be brokers of truth and brokers of love. To forgive one another. And those assumptions that we make, once all this was cleared away, I love these words. Joshua 22, verse 33. They talked no more about going to war. It was all cleared up. It was all fine. And then look at this, Joshua 22, verse 31. Today we know that the Lord is with us. When we are committed to both truth and love, unity is a happy result, and we see the Lord in our midst. So what about you? Have you found yourselves jumping to conclusions, making rash judgments about others? Maybe today it's time to go and rectify things. Maybe it's time to go and talk to somebody and say, hey, I'm sorry about this. Maybe it's time again to embrace this love. For the people will know and not assume that we are followers of Jesus when they look in and they say, look how much they love. I want to call the band up now as we close this service. And as they're coming up, there's the final verse in the text that I haven't yet read. Joshua 22, verse 34. It says, and the Reubenites and the Gadites gave the altar this name, a witness between us that the Lord is God. The very thing that was potentially going to divide them turned out to unite them. Turned out to unite them and to be a witness of their unity, and that the God they served was in their midst. And we too have something that unites us. Something that binds us together. Something that shows that yes, even though tensions may arise, if we have a commitment to truth, commitment to love, we can go and talk to one another. Because of what Jesus has done, we can follow his mode of forgiveness. That inspires unity. And the symbol that we have is what Christ has done for us. It's the cross that he died for us. It's the incredible love that he showed to each and every one of us.